The grand halls of the Alari diplomatic station shimmered with golden light, the air thick with the scent of exotic flowers and the quiet hum of distant machinery. Princess Xylara stood at the center, draped in flowing silver robes that shimmered like liquid metal. Her expression was unreadable, her violet eyes calm as she observed the arriving human delegation. This was a historic moment. After years of strained relations between the Alari Empire and humanity, peace talks had finally begun. The humans, ever bold, had sent a mix of diplomats, scientists, and military personnel. Among them was Commander Daniel Hayes, a soldier, not a politician, and the only one who seemed completely at ease in this unfamiliar setting. Xylara studied him from across the hall, noting his broad shoulders, the casual way he stood with his arms crossed. He wasn't disrespectful, but there was a lack of deference that she wasn't used to. Most beings trembled in her presence. Even powerful warlords spoke carefully around her. But this human, he looked at her as if she were just another person. Princess Xylara, one of the human diplomats, began, stepping forward. "It is an honor to." "I don't need pleasantries," Xylara interrupted smoothly. "Let us discuss what truly matters." There was a brief silence before the diplomat nodded. But before anyone could continue, Daniel spoke. "Finally, someone who doesn't waste time." The words were simple, but something about the way he said them made Xylara's spine stiffen. There was no fear in his voice, only amusement. As if they were equals. She had met warriors, kings, and strategists, but none of them had ever dared to speak so casually in her presence. Her gaze snapped to him, sharp and assessing. "You are not a diplomat," she stated. Daniel gave a lopsided smile. "No, I'm here as a security advisor. But I do know one thing. If this treaty is going to work, both sides need to be honest with each other." She narrowed her eyes slightly, intrigued, but also mildly irritated. Honesty. The Alari were always honest. It was the humans who were unpredictable. "Then tell me, human," Xylara said, her voice controlled. "What does your species want from this treaty?" Daniel didn't hesitate. Peace, trade, and an end to unnecessary bloodshed. His answer was logical, expected, yet something about the way he spoke, direct, confident, unwavering, made her feel something strange. Xylara was a master of control, but for the first time in years, she felt something slip. A flicker of irritation, a hint of curiosity, and an emotion she couldn't quite name. The meeting continued, but Xylara found her mind drifting. Why did this one human soldier stand out so much? The diplomatic hall was filled with voices as the negotiations began. The Alari delegation, led by Princess Xylara, spoke in their usual formal and precise manner, each word carefully measured. The human diplomats responded in a more direct and straightforward way, which sometimes clashed with the Alari's refined style. But Commander Daniel Hayes, he was different. Xylara had expected humans to be aggressive or impatient, yet this soldier remained calm. His eyes were sharp, analyzing everything, but his posture was relaxed, almost as if he was enjoying himself. It was unsettling. She focused on the discussion, but every time Daniel spoke, her attention drifted toward him. He wasn't afraid of her, that much was clear. That alone made him stand out. "The Alari people value discipline and order," Xylara said, her voice steady. "We do not rush decisions. Every treaty must be carefully considered." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "And how long do you think it will take? Months? Years?" He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked onto hers. "Because where I come from, delays in peace talks usually mean more people die." His words were blunt, too blunt. The Alari side of the room fell into a tense silence. Xylara should have been insulted, should have reminded him of his place. Yet, she felt something else instead. Annoyance and curiosity. "You humans are always in a hurry," she replied smoothly. "Quick to act, quick to fight." Daniel shrugged. Sometimes action saves lives. If this treaty drags on, more battles could break out. More soldiers, both human and Aelari, will die for no reason. Silara's fingers curled slightly against the smooth surface of the table. His logic was sound, but it was his tone that unsettled her. He spoke to her like an equal, like someone who didn't care that she was royalty. She didn't know if she liked it or hated it. Another Aelari diplomat tried to steer the conversation back to technical matters, but the energy in the room had changed. The tension between Silara and Daniel was undeniable, though neither acknowledged it. As the discussions continued, Silara found herself watching him carefully. His words, his expressions, even the way he reacted to disagreements, it was all different from what she expected. For the first time in her life, someone had made her feel off balance. By the time the meeting ended, she was certain of one thing. Daniel Hayes was going to be a problem. The meeting had ended, but Princess Silara's mind was still restless. Commander Daniel Hayes, a mere human soldier, had managed to challenge her without fear. She had faced kings and warlords, yet none had made her feel as off balance as he did. As she walked through the diplomatic station's grand corridors, her guards followed at a respectful distance. The Aelari architecture was sleek and elegant, golden walls glowing softly, reflecting the stars beyond the massive windows. Then, an explosion rocked the station. The ground shook violently. Alarms blared. Lights flickered. The guards immediately surrounded Silara as panic spread through the corridors. "Status report," she demanded, keeping her voice steady. A guard pressed his communicator. "Unknown attackers, Your Highness. They've breached the lower levels." Before Silara could respond, another explosion blasted through a nearby corridor. The force sent her crashing against a wall, the impact stunning her for a brief moment. When her vision cleared, she saw her guards scattered, some unconscious, others struggling to get up. Smoke filled the corridor, and standing nearby, Daniel Hayes. He coughed, waving away the smoke. His uniform was scorched, but he looked more annoyed than injured. His sharp eyes locked onto hers. "You still alive, Princess?" he asked. Silara bristled at his tone, but forced herself to remain composed. "Of course," she said. "What happened?" Daniel glanced around. "Looks like someone doesn't want this treaty happening. We need to move." Silara straightened. "I do not run." Daniel exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated. "Then let me rephrase. We need to survive first. Then you can give your royal speeches." She glared at him, but he was already scanning their surroundings, his soldier instincts taking over. "The attackers are blocking the main exits," he said. "We take the maintenance tunnels." Silara hesitated. She was a princess, a leader, not someone who sneaked through service tunnels like a fugitive. Daniel must have seen her reluctance because he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen, Your Highness, I get it. You're used to control. But right now, control won't keep you alive. Let's move." She didn't like his tone, but she couldn't argue with the logic. Nodding sharply, she followed as he led the way. As they ran through the dimly lit tunnels, Silara found herself watching him closely. His movements were precise, efficient, clearly a man trained for survival. For the first time, she felt a strange sense of trust toward him. She didn't know why, but she knew one thing. This human might just be the key to getting out of this alive. The maintenance tunnels were dark, the air thick with dust, and the distant sound of explosions echoing through the station. Silara, once used to the comforts of royal life, now found herself scrambling through narrow passages, her fine clothing getting caught on metal pipes and her mind racing. Daniel, however, moved effortlessly through the tunnels. His steps were sure, his eyes scanning their surroundings. Focused, calm. Silara couldn't help but watch him. There was something almost primal in the way he moved. No hesitation, no fear, just pure determination. It was a stark contrast to her own carefully controlled demeanor. She had spent her entire life being taught to never show weakness, to always appear composed. But here, in these filthy tunnels, with danger closing in around them, she felt anything but in control. "Keep up, princess," Daniel called over his shoulder, his voice light, as though they were simply walking through the halls of a palace instead of running for their lives. Silara gritted her teeth but obeyed, her pride pushing her forward. "How much farther?" she asked, trying to sound as composed as ever, even as her heart pounded in her chest. Daniel glanced back at her, offering a half-smile. "Not much. Stay close." The words were simple, but it was the way he said them that caught her off guard. There was no respectful distance between them, no formality. He spoke to her as if she were just another soldier, an equal in the fight for survival. It was a sharp contrast to the way others treated her, always bowing and offering words of reverence. A surge of irritation flashed through her. She wasn't some soldier. She was the princess of the Aelari Empire, a leader. Yet in this moment, with Daniel leading her through the chaos, she couldn't help but feel disoriented, out of place. A loud noise echoed ahead, and they both froze. "More attackers," Daniel muttered, his hand resting on the weapon at his side. Silara instinctively reached for her blade, though she didn't have the same training as Daniel. She had never been in a real fight, never needed to be. As a princess, her role had always been more diplomatic. But here, in the face of real danger, her mind was racing, and she could feel her calm mask starting to slip. "Stay behind me," Daniel ordered, his voice serious now. For a moment, Silara felt a surge of frustration. Why should she hide behind him? But before she could argue, Daniel took a step forward and turned to face her. His eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. "Trust me," he said, as though reading her mind. The words hit her harder than she expected. "Trust me." It was a simple phrase, yet it carried so much weight. In that moment, Silara realized she did trust him, in a way she had never trusted anyone else before. He had no reason to help her, and yet, here he was, putting his life on the line. She took a deep breath, her pride still burning inside her, but something else was growing: respect. And maybe, just maybe, something more. "All right," she said, her voice steady, but softer than usual. "Lead the way." For the first time since they had met, Silara felt a strange sense of peace, as though they were truly a team. And for once, she didn't mind being led by this human soldier. The tunnels were silent for a moment, save for the faint hum of distant machinery and the soft echo of their footsteps. Silara followed closely behind Commander Daniel Hayes, her eyes sharp, alert. Her mind was a swirl of thoughts. She had never felt so vulnerable, so unprepared. Yet there was something about Daniel's calm presence that made her feel oddly safe. Ahead of them, the tunnel opened into a wide space, a small maintenance chamber. The walls were lined with wires and rusted pipes, the air thick with the smell of oil and dust. Daniel stopped, signaling for Silara to be quiet. His gaze swept over the room, assessing, always assessing. "We'll rest here for a minute," he whispered, his voice low and commanding. "The attackers might not know we've moved yet." Silara nodded, keeping her posture straight. Though her body ached from running and ducking through the narrow passages, she wasn't used to physical exertion like this. Back at the palace, she had been trained in politics, diplomacy, and etiquette, not combat or survival. But now she could see that Daniel's world was different. He was no stranger to danger, and it was clear he had learned to adapt quickly. "Your Highness," Daniel said, breaking her thoughts. "You did well back there. You didn't panic." The compliment caught her off guard. She had been too focused on survival to think about what she was doing, but hearing it from him, it made her uncomfortable. "I had no choice," she replied, her voice steady. "I am not one to run from danger." Daniel glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't talking about that." He paused, then continued, his tone softer. "I meant your calm. You kept your head. That's more than most people can say in a situation like this." Silara felt a strange warmth at his words, something she hadn't expected. She had always been taught that emotions were a weakness, that showing fear or doubt would make others question her ability to lead. But Daniel didn't seem to see it that way. He respected her for it. "You are too kind," she said, her voice quieter now. Daniel gave a half smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm not kind, just observant." Silara's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, a sudden noise interrupted their conversation. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside the chamber. Without hesitation, Daniel drew his weapon, his movements swift and precise. Silara instinctively reached for her own blade, though she knew she was far from ready to fight in the way Daniel was. "We need to move," Daniel muttered, scanning the room for an exit. Silara nodded. They didn't have time for words now. The danger was real, and they needed to act. As they moved into the shadows, she found herself watching Daniel's every move. There was respect in the way he handled his weapon, in the way he looked after her safety, even when she was royalty, and he was just a soldier. In that moment, she realized something important. She wasn't just following him out of necessity anymore. There was something else, a bond of mutual respect that went deeper than titles or rank. They were equals in this fight for survival. And for the first time, Silara wasn't bothered by that. "Stay close," Daniel whispered, his voice steady, his gaze locked ahead. "We're not out of this yet." Silara nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't a princess right now. She was a fighter, just like him. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, the only noise in an otherwise tense silence. Silara's heart beat in her chest, the adrenaline keeping her on edge. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hide danger, and she was hyper-aware of every movement Daniel made as he led the way. The human soldier had been nothing but reliable so far, but they both knew the real danger was only just beginning. They had made it past several security checkpoints, and were now heading deeper into the lower levels of the station. Silara's legs were aching from the constant movement, and her mind was starting to race with too many thoughts. She had never been in this position before, cut off from her people, running for her life. She was used to control, used to being the one who issued orders, not the one who had to take orders. "How much further?" she asked, trying to sound calm, though the exhaustion was starting to show in her voice. Daniel paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the hallway. He was always looking ahead, always alert. "Not far," he replied shortly, "but we need to keep moving. The attackers might be close." Silara nodded, taking a deep breath. She had to stay strong. She was a princess, after all. But in this moment, she couldn't help but feel small, vulnerable in a way she never had before. The sound of footsteps from behind made her freeze. Daniel immediately turned to face her, his expression hardening. "Get down," he whispered urgently. Before she could react, Daniel pulled her into a narrow alcove, his hand on her shoulder as he guided her out of sight. Silara's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to be so close, his body pressed against hers as they both waited, holding their breath. It was only for a moment, but that moment stretched on. She could feel the heat of his body against hers, could hear the steady rhythm of his heart. Her mind raced, and she realized that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't the one in control of the situation. She wasn't in command of her emotions either. The footsteps outside grew louder, and Silara felt a rush of panic. Her pride told her she shouldn't feel like this, but the fear was real. She hated it. She hated how vulnerable she was. Daniel, sensing her tension, shifted slightly to shield her. "Stay still," he whispered, his voice low and firm. Silara's chest tightened as she tried to focus, tried to calm her racing thoughts. But it wasn't easy. This was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She was no longer just a princess. She was a target, and the weight of that reality was almost overwhelming. After a few tense moments, the footsteps faded. Daniel let out a quiet breath of relief, but Silara was still shaking. though she didn't let him see it. "That was close," she said, her voice shaky despite her efforts to keep it steady. Daniel glanced at her, his gaze softer than she had expected. "You did well," he said quietly. She met his gaze for a moment, and something shifted between them. He wasn't just protecting her because it was his job. There was something more in his eyes, something that made her feel both confused and comforted. For a moment, Silara let down her guard just a little. She let herself feel the fear, the vulnerability. It was something she rarely allowed herself to do. But in this moment, with Daniel so close, she realized something. She didn't have to be perfect all the time. She didn't have to be always composed. For the first time, in a long while, she could simply be human. The corridors of the station were eerily quiet now. The sound of explosions and gunfire had faded into the distance, replaced by an almost unnatural stillness. Silara's heart still pounded in her chest, and her mind was racing. They had narrowly escaped the last group of attackers, but they couldn't stop. Not yet. "We're close now," Daniel said, his voice steady as he led the way. His eyes were sharp, scanning every corner, every shadow, but his expression remained calm. It was clear that despite the chaos around them, he was in his element. He was a soldier, born for moments like this. Silara, on the other hand, had never been this far out of her comfort zone. Her entire life had been built around control, around keeping her emotions in check, around making decisions that shaped the future of her people. But now she was running for her life, depending on a human soldier to get her to safety. Her pride still burned. She didn't want to feel weak, didn't want to admit that she had no idea how to handle the situation. But the reality was, she needed Daniel. She needed his experience, his strength, and his unwavering focus. "We'll be fine," Daniel said suddenly, glancing back at her. "We're almost there." Silara nodded, but she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She wasn't used to relying on others, especially not on a human. Yet here she was, trusting him without question. They rounded another corner, and Silara's eyes caught a glimpse of the emergency exit in the distance. She could almost taste the relief, the freedom that awaited them outside. But just as they reached the final stretch, a voice rang out from behind them. "You're not going anywhere." Silara froze. Daniel whipped around, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. But the voice came from a familiar source. An Aelari soldier, one of Silara's own guards. The man's face was hard, his eyes filled with distrust. "You traitor," the soldier spat, his weapon aimed directly at Silara. "You're helping this human." Silara's heart raced, but she stood tall, her posture still regal despite the circumstances. "I am doing what is necessary," she said coldly. "You are not in a position to judge me." The soldier scoffed. "You've lost your way, princess. Your people are dying, and you're running away with a human. What would your father think of this?" Silara felt a sharp pain in her chest at the mention of her father, but she refused to show it. She was not weak. Daniel stepped forward, his stance firm. "The only thing that matters now is getting out of here alive. If you want to fight, fine, but you'll have to go through me first." Silara looked at Daniel, surprised at the fierce protectiveness in his words. For a moment, she felt something deep inside stir, a feeling she couldn't quite explain. But before she could speak, another figure appeared behind the soldier. It was one of the station's high-ranking officers. "Stop," the officer said sharply, his voice carrying authority. "This is not the time for this." The soldier hesitated, his weapon still aimed at Silara, but he didn't fire. The officer stepped between them, his eyes narrowed. "Princess Silara has made her decision. You will respect that." The soldier cursed under his breath, but lowered his weapon. "Fine," he muttered, stepping back. Silara's breath caught in her throat. The confrontation had been close, too close, but it was what happened next that startled her. As the officer turned away, he caught Daniel's eye. "The humans were right," he muttered. "It's time for all of us to adapt. Maybe your way isn't so wrong after all. Daniel watched the officer for a moment, then nodded. Silara looked from the soldier to Daniel, her mind spinning. The shift was happening. Things were changing faster than she could have imagined. But one thing was clear. Her trust in Daniel was no longer just a necessity. It was a choice. With a final glance at the officer, Silara turned toward the exit. The road ahead was uncertain, but she wasn't facing it alone anymore. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The emergency exit doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the vast expanse of the station's landing bay. The sound of distant engines and the flashing lights from nearby ships filled the air. But for a brief moment, all Silara could hear was her own breath, heavy and rushed. The relief of reaching safety was almost overwhelming. But there was no time to stop. The fight wasn't over. The escape was still in progress. The attackers were still out there, and their pursuit was relentless. "Get to the ship," Daniel instructed, his voice sharp and commanding. "We're almost there." Silara nodded, her mind still racing from the confrontation with her own people. The tension from earlier still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. For a moment, she had wondered if her journey was going to end in a fatal mistake. But Daniel had stepped in, protecting her from the guards and soldiers who still didn't understand. The way he had stepped forward for her had shaken her more than she cared to admit. "Stay close," Daniel said again, his eyes scanning the landing bay for any signs of danger. Silara kept her distance, yet she couldn't help but feel the closeness between them, even as the chaos of the escape pulsed around them. There was a strange connection forming between them, a shift she hadn't expected, one that both scared and intrigued her. They'd reached the waiting ship, a small but sturdy vessel, and Silara followed Daniel up the ramp, her mind still spinning. She had always been the one to lead, the one who made the decisions, but now she was following him, relying on his strength and guidance. It felt strange, unfamiliar, but at the same time, she couldn't deny how it made her feel safe. The doors sealed behind them, and the ship's engines roared to life. They were leaving the station behind. Silara sat in the seat Daniel pointed to, her fingers gripping the armrests tightly. Her heart was still racing, but now there was a new kind of nervous energy coursing through her veins. Daniel took the controls, expertly guiding the ship away from the station. His focus was intense, his eyes sharp as he maneuvered the vessel through the chaos of the battle outside. Silara watched him for a moment, admiring the way he seemed to control the situation with such ease. But she could also see something in his face, a tension that matched her own. He glanced at her, his expression guarded but soft. "You did well back there." Silara's lips parted in surprise. "I didn't expect that from you," she said quietly, her voice uncertain. "You've always been so confident." Daniel met her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment. Confidence is easier when you've been through things that make you question everything else. There was a weight to his words that made Silara pause. She had always thought of herself as someone with a strong sense of purpose, but in this moment she realized just how fragile everything she had once believed was. Her kingdom, her family, her status, it was all changing. And the one thing that seemed constant was the connection between her and Daniel. "I'm not used to this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "to relying on someone else." Daniel's eyes softened. "I get it. But right now, you don't have to do it alone." The sincerity in his voice caught Silara off guard. For a moment, she was speechless, unsure of how to respond. She had never allowed herself to be vulnerable, to let someone else into her world. But Daniel wasn't just anyone. He had shown her something she hadn't seen in herself before, strength in vulnerability. As the ship flew further into the vastness of space, Silara knew that the road ahead would not be easy. They still had enemies to face, obstacles to overcome, but she wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time, she didn't mind. The vastness of space stretched before them as the ship glided smoothly through the darkness, the hum of the engines a constant reminder of the journey that was still ahead. Celara sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse outside the window. Stars shimmered like distant memories, and the feeling of being far from the chaos of the station was almost surreal. But even in the silence, the weight of what had happened lingered. The attackers, her own soldiers, the betrayal, it was all too much to process in one moment. The last few hours had shaken her, but it was the silence now that unsettled her most. "Why didn't you stay back?" Celara's voice broke the quiet. She hadn't meant to speak the words aloud, but the question had been weighing on her mind ever since Daniel had stood in front of her earlier, refusing to let her be taken by her own people. Daniel, who had been focused on the ship's controls, glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "What do you mean?" "You had a choice," she said, her voice softer now. "You could have stayed back. You didn't have to stand up for me." For a moment, Daniel didn't respond. He kept his eyes on the controls, his hand steady as he navigated the ship through the vast expanse of space. But Celara could see the flicker of something in his gaze, something she couldn't quite place. "You're right," he said after a long pause, his tone calm but with a hint of something more. "I didn't have to, but I chose to." Celara felt a strange flutter in her chest at his words. He had chosen to stand by her, to help her. He wasn't just doing his job. He was doing something personal, something that wasn't required of him. "Why?" she asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He seemed to think it over for a moment, his gaze fixed on the stars outside. "I've seen enough of people pretending to be something they're not," he said finally. "Too many times I've seen leaders play games, hide behind their titles. But you're different." Celara didn't know what to say to that. She had always been the princess, always surrounded by the weight of her crown, her duty, her empire. But with Daniel, she wasn't just a title. She wasn't just a leader or a figurehead. She was herself, a person, someone who was learning to feel, to trust, to let down the walls she had built around herself for so long. "I don't know what to do anymore," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I thought I knew, it's all slipping away." Daniel's gaze softened, and for the first time, Celara saw the genuine concern in his eyes. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice firm. "We're in this together." The words hit her like a wave, and she found herself shocked by the sincerity in his voice. He wasn't just offering empty comfort. He meant it. Celara took a deep breath, feeling a mix of emotions swirl inside her. She had always been in control, always in charge of her own destiny. But now she was realizing something. Control wasn't everything. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice soft but sincere. "For everything." Daniel gave a small nod, his expression steady. "Don't mention it. It's what I do." Celara turned her gaze back to the stars, her mind still racing. There was still so much she didn't understand about the future, about the choices she had to make. But there was one thing she was certain of now. She wasn't facing it alone. And for the first time in her life, that felt like enough. The journey ahead was uncertain, but with Daniel by her side, Celara felt a new sense of purpose stir within her. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a warrior. And she would fight for what she believed in, no matter the cost. The ship's engines hummed steadily as it flew deeper into the unknown. Celara leaned back in her seat, her gaze fixed on the stars outside the window. The journey ahead was long, but at least it felt like they were heading somewhere, away from the danger and the chaos of the station. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but there was one question she kept returning to. What now? She wasn't sure where this path would lead her. Her world had been turned upside down in a matter of hours. She was no longer just a princess. She was a fugitive, a person without a kingdom to call her own. The once clear path she had always walked, one filled with rules, expectations, and duty, had now blurred into something uncertain. But what terrified her most was the realization that she was finally beginning to question everything she had ever known. Her duty, her role, even her own people. Beside her, Daniel sat at the controls, his hand steady, his focus unwavering. He was the same as ever, calm, composed, ready for anything. The contrast between him and the way her life had been only days ago was striking. He had chosen to stand by her, to help her, when no one else had. "Where are we going?" Celara asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was softer than usual, laced with uncertainty. Daniel glanced over at her, his expression calm but thoughtful. "First, we get you somewhere safe. After that, we figure it out." She nodded slowly, her thoughts still swirling. Safe. It was a word she hadn't thought about in a long time. Growing up, she had always felt safe, protected by her family, by her title. But now she felt anything but safe. "Are you ever afraid?" she asked, almost as an afterthought. The question slipped out before she could stop it. She had always been taught that fear was a weakness, something to be hidden away. But in this moment, with everything falling apart around her, it was a question she needed answered. Daniel's eyes softened slightly, and for a moment, Celara thought she saw a flicker of something personal in his gaze. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "I've been afraid, a lot of times. But fear doesn't stop me from moving forward. It just makes me more careful." Celara took a deep breath, her heart heavy with the weight of the unknown. The more she learned about Daniel, the more she realized that he wasn't just a soldier. He was a man of conviction, someone who had learned to face the world head-on, no matter the challenges. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted quietly, her voice tinged with doubt. "I don't know if I can lead my people anymore. I don't know what's next." Daniel's gaze met hers, his eyes steady. "You've already been leading, Celara. You just didn't know it. You didn't need a title to make decisions. You don't need to have all the answers, but you've got the heart to do what's right. That's all that matters." For the first time in days, Celara felt a flicker of hope rise inside her. She wasn't just running anymore. She was choosing. Choosing to move forward. Choosing to trust. And for the first time, she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could still make a difference. "I'm not alone in this," she whispered to herself, though she knew Daniel could hear her. He gave a small nod. "No, you're not." As the ship continued its journey through the vastness of space, Celara realized something powerful. The road ahead was uncertain, and she had no idea what awaited her, but she wasn't facing it alone. And for the first time, that felt like enough. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a leader, a survivor, and now she was ready for whatever came next.